as I start recording this video, we're the 12th of July 2023. And I intend to talk for approximately 1 hour about conspiracies in an intelligent way. But first, I'll begin by saying that we are living a revolutionary era, and if I had to give the reason intelligently and in a rational way, it's simply because public speech on the part of the figures of authority, politicians, journalists, scholars, public intellectuals, etc., is losing its legitimacy in the Western world predominantly because of the spread of information and alternative sources of information. And that's why eventually, at some moment, it's already we have already experienced the first manifestations of this already with Brexit and Trump, etc., and the rise of the populist right in a lot of Western countries. But it will only intensify with the coming months or years, I don't know how long, but public speech on the part of the current figures of authority is being discredited, and it's a process which shakes the entire institutional and social structure. And that's why the documents that I've been introducing at the beginning of the video, first they show how I envision rigorously and as simply as possible in a short amount of time, in an ordered and structured way, the totality of a society which exists within the physical world of physics, chemistry, biology, but the social world, from sociobiology to economics, government, etc. And a few pieces of advice, namely, if I had to simplify, minimalism, discipline, and trying to work with your local environment to promote stability, order, and structure, and to help people. It's in everyone's best interest. I'm not asking others, or I do not ask this for myself. I do not participate in civic life out of necessarily the kindness of my heart, although I can have a very kind heart, but because it's in the interest. That's the difference between generosity and solidarity. Generosity is if you want to be good, to do good and acts of kindness or altruism just because God gave you a heart overwhelmed with kindness and positivity. You can do it, of course. But solidarity, precisely, is intelligent, mutually, reciprocally helping behavior. Namely, solidarity means to act in your interest while acknowledging that it is in your interest to help others, not altruistically, but in a selfish, altruistic way. Namely, solidarity, as I understand this, which can be defined as civic virtue, is to do this consciously, because you have to understand that it's whoever you are, wherever you are, it's in your interest to promote the intelligence, the stability, the cohesion of your immediate local environment. It can be the neighborhood, the town, the region, the state, in the case of federal states like the US or the country at large, it's in your best interest, because the more people are stable, balanced, have an ordered lifestyle, the better the cohesion, and the better it is for everyone. So that solidarity means to help others, not necessarily because you love them or you like them, because it can be impersonal, it can be anonymous, so you don't know who you help, but it means to help others because it's in the interest of everyone to cooperate for the greater cohesion of society, especially in troubled times. And I don't believe in socialism. I don't believe in statism. Maybe there has to be a limited amount of government. Here, these are the debates of the libertarians between the minarchists, those who think of the state as a night watchman, supposed to provide just law and order, those who are completely anarcho-libertarians, those who are ordo-liberal, who want a strong state to favor market forces, although it's kind of contradictory, not in a good sense. So, yeah, here the theoretical debates are not really interesting as such. My view is that statism, the state, in order for society to be healthy, it has to be reduced to the greatest extent possible, and of course it has to be compensated by civic participation. Here, I understood this a few months ago, and it is a very useful, in my view, conceptual distinction drawn by the classical American conservatives, not the modern conservatives, but the old right, the old conservatives, not in terms of age, in terms of tradition. In the 1930s, at the moment of the New Deal and Roosevelt, etc., the anti-New Deal American thinkers, mostly conservative or libertarians, they drew a distinction, as far as I know. People like Albert J. Nock, Chodorov, and people like this, between the state. Here it means not the state apparatus. Between the state and civil society, and one often grows at the expense of the other. The more state intervention grows, welfare, regulations, compulsory education, insurance, healthcare, etc. The more state intervention grows, the more society is being devitalized, because there is no longer need, at least in the short term, to have personal relationship between the members of society, because it is an impersonal bureaucracy which takes care of everything. But the problem is that for inherent social and economic reason, it doesn't work. It is financed upon debt. It destroys public integrity, because it breeds corruption, lack of responsibility. It's economically inefficient. It has to be financed by debt, etc. So it doesn't work in the long term. So in order to reconstruct society, here I'm speaking mostly in the case of the modern West, people have to act on their own effort and their own willingness to reconstruct social cohesion, because state interventionism is not sustainable for many reasons, economically, socially, anthropologically. It's not sustainable. So people, what I promote and what I've been doing for months and months consistently is practice civic virtue, not because I'm a good citizen, although I am becoming better and better, but it's just because I don't believe in the state, I don't believe in socialism, I don't believe in interventionism, I don't believe in the welfare state, I don't believe in collectivism. But the counterpart, if you want to, it's not if you want to get rid of this, because it will get rid of itself for inherent reasons, but if you want the transition to be as stable and as peaceful as possible, it requires involvement on the part of most people, and I've been doing my part on my own local level, and here are some good pieces of advice that I can give. Yeah. Consistency is important. I have been consistent in participating in various charities, giving away books, intelligent books to help poor people who are not used to reading a lot, making donations in the form of books to libraries, making supplies, wearing interesting t-shirts with messages in public to inspire people, maybe. Yeah, that was the introduction. Yeah. I intended to talk about conspiracy theories. In case it's not clear, but I've already said this so many times, I have had spiritual experiences. So I'm a religious person, believe it or not. That's one of my best jokes. I'm a very religious person, believe it or not. Maybe maybe this joke will become legendary at some moment. It's really a good joke. Yeah, so basically I'm just a religious person, but the difference between me and a lot of others, not all, because there are others like me, is that I am also scientifically minded, and my view of religion is actually philosophical, namely philosophy and religion are not opposed, they talk about the same content, but simply philosophy, if it's serious, includes within itself a scientific mindset, a rigorous conceptual view. So I'm just a religious person who can talk intelligently about most scientific topics. I have no problem talking about people like Dawkins. Dawkins says a lot of intelligent things, but here it's not the purpose to talk about the distinction between science as is commonly understood and religion, but basically spirituality is rational, but in a different way than what is often understood. Precisely, that's the difference between der Verstand and die Vernunft in German terminology. Yeah. So, about conspiracy theories or conspiracies or whatever. The spear in conspiracy is the same root, the same Latin root as spirit. It comes from Latin spiritus, which means the breath. That's the invisible substance which causes, in a way, the movement of minds and of souls. That's the moving force of events. Yeah, the invisible substance which moves the world, in a way. That can be envisioned like this. So yeah. And usually people who are inclined towards believing in conspiracies, they believe that there is an agent, not necessarily an individual, but a group of individuals, or an ideology, or an entity, a group of people, usually, who controls world events. Yeah, and often in the long term they planned ahead, and the unfolding of world events is in accordance with the intention of this entity, variously determined. Yeah, but in theology, there used to be, up until a couple of centuries ago, a name for the entity which was supposed to guide the unfolding of world events, it used to be called Providence. That's a classical theological view, that Providence, as far as I know, it comes from Latin, it means to see forward. Providere means, as far as I know, is to see before, in a way, that's foresight, but active foresight. So Providence, in a theological perspective, is the hand of God directing the unfolding of events. That's a classical religious view. So the people who attribute most or all worldly events, especially negative ones, to an entity which is supposed to be in control, it's a religious way of thinking. Yeah. And the conspiracy theorists, they tend to attribute most or all negative events to the entity that they accuse of being responsible, and it can be the Freemasons, the reptilians, a certain ethno-religious group which is often blamed for events. It can be the communists, the rich, the Bilderberg group, the globalists. There are many entities. So basically, the way a lot of people think when they think about world events is that they project onto an entity the causal ability to bring about world events. So they reduce the infinite multiplicity of events, and usually negative events, to this entity. So yeah, in the case of conspiracy theories, these are usually negative events which are attributed to the supposedly controlling entity, variously defined. Yeah, whereas Providence, in classical theology, the good events were predicated to God. Yeah. So, but that's formally that's a religious way of thinking, because religion is not devoid of thought, and thought, which tends to express itself in the purest way in philosophy, precisely is religious. Yeah. So the formal structure of the conspiracy theorist is religious, formally, even if they are atheist. Yeah. But the problem, here I will not show the document that I have here, but I've showed the document at the beginning of the video. The philosophy of I'm in a good mood. The intelligent and great German philosopher. Yeah, there are many intelligent and great German philosophers, but the one I think about, his philosophy can be defined among many other predicates as the philosophy of mediation. And the problem with the conspiracy theorists is that they reduce really the infinite multiplicity and complexity of events or negative events to one simple causal factor. And the problem is that it's not mediated, and in a way it's so simple sometimes that's why it's not that's why they are not considered serious. It's because they have a tendency to oversimplify, and basically if we take this to really a simplistic logic, it's Manicheism. All the good events, you say, that must be God, and all the negative events which happen in the world, you can say, that must be the work of the devil. That's dualism, Manichaistic, dualistic view. And here, really, even the most primitive, here it's not in a good sense, the most primitive religious-minded people, even they do not think in such a simplistic way. Even religious groups of people who are not very, either very well economically developed or with a lot of culture or with not a very highly quantitatively measure of intelligence, even this group, usually they think in a more complex way than simply saying, oh, good versus evil. Yeah, and a lot of conspiracy theorists, if you navigate through their views, it's really simplistic, which is blinding, and yeah, because without mediation, the formal way that this works is that any event in politics, finance, economics, sociology, it can be crime or the dissolution of society or any event in government affairs or global affairs, geopolitics, the one entity, for the people who are really narrow-minded, they predicate the causal agency to the entity that they have selected, the Freemasons, the communists, the rich, the minority elite group, which is often blamed, etc. It's cheap intellectually. It doesn't mean, yeah, that's precisely what I intend to talk about. It doesn't mean that it's completely false, but formally it's usually very cheap. And the useful aspect about this way of thinking is that it enables the whole of society to be relieved from its flaws or lack or deficiencies, because precisely all the negativity is put, the blame for all the negativity is put on the one agent, which are often a few individuals, and it enables the whole of society not to take the responsibility for all the things which affect society negatively. And here, it's not a conspiracy theory, but just in a lot of leftist thinking, they just tend to blame the rich because they are a tiny minority, the very rich. So blaming the rich or capitalism in a very ill-defined way, that's not the case of all leftists, but those who do, it's really a simplistic way, like, we should have it all good, but there are these greedy rich who are responsible for all the problems. So you put all the blame onto a tiny group, which is ill-defined, vague, which then, in a way, it alleviates the burden of suffering to the rest of society. Then the 1%, the 99%, then they are absolved of all problems, because the 1%, the very rich, they are accused of all the ills. Yeah, that's how it works. That's the formal way. That's the good aspect of really negativity, is that when there is a scapegoat, it enables the rest of society, the whole of society, to feel good about itself, because all the sins are put onto this one causal agent. That's a religious way of thinking. That's the story of Jesus in a different way. Although Jesus was the good guy, but basically all the sins were put on Jesus, which then liberated the whole of mankind for the rest of the historical process, because there is one scapegoat who took the blame for the collective. But here, not just in Palestine 2,000 years ago, but for the entire human collective. That's the story of Jesus. That's just the religious mentality putting, when the community put all the negativity, the suffering that they endure, they put this on an agent which is held responsible by a ritual sacrifice, the crucifixion of Christ, is that which enables them to purify the community, because then they are absolved of all their sins. That's yeah. And this structure has repeated itself over and over again. Yeah. And those who, of course, there are groups which defend their interests, and when or if they do collide with the interest of other groups, of course, they have negative consequences for others. And those who tend to be the most intelligent or the most with the best abilities, they tend to get the most blame. This is why the Jews are often blamed, because they tend, the Ashkenazi Jews, to be to have a higher level of intelligence. So therefore, in meritocratic society, they tend to have better status and better economic, socio-economic position, because either because they are more intelligent or because they work harder, or both, and therefore it breeds resentment, like resentment against Chinese minorities in some Southeast Asian countries, because the Chinese minorities, they tend to be more successful, or the resentment against whites in a country like South Africa, or in some Southern American countries, or even in Western countries where whites are still a minority, they are nonetheless blamed very often because they are more successful. That's systemic racism, majority privilege, or whatever they call this. So people who are more successful in society, they tend to get the blame. It can be empirically noticed very often. That's one of the reasons. That's not the only reason, but that's one of the reasons why the Jews tend to get a lot of blame, because historically they have been more successful. There are various reasons: higher education, higher IQ, higher work ethic, etc. And in the modern world, the people who tend to get the blame, these are white people, because historically they have been, over the past 500 years, a lot more successful than everyone else, so they get the blame. That's not the only reason, and when you want to blame a group of people, you project and attribute to this group all the negative aspects without mentioning the good ones. That's how it works. But precisely, I will not show the document, but I will take an example. I've been thinking about this recently, but it has been a recurrent feature in my way of thinking. It's one might say the Marxist. Here I have to praise the Marxist intellectual. I do not very often praise the Marxist, but here credit be given to them, because here I will make a joke which is not, it's not comic, maybe it's comical, but it's a profound joke, because most of what is good in Marxism comes, of course, from Hegel. So I didn't understood this 10 years ago when I started my intellectual awakening, but now with more ability to look backward, with more experience, more maturity, I understand that actually what seems, or maybe is vaguely intelligent in Marxism, actually a good old Karl Marx, he borrowed most, if not all, his good ideas from Hegel. So the people, the Marxist intellectuals, or not necessarily intellectuals as such, but the people who are influenced by Marx, when they say intelligent things, which can happen, here, if I'm honest, sometimes they say intelligent things. But if you dig a little bit underneath the surface of the intelligent analysis that they might provide, you realize that it comes from Hegel, basically, the good things. So, but yeah, the Marxists, the intelligent ones, here they tend to think intelligently because they understand precisely. Here, in a country like France, the intellectual training of a lot of people is Marxist, which is negative because it brings groupthink and intellectual collectivism in a negative sense, dogmatic, sterile way of thinking. But the good thing is that, so here that's the formal problem. Then the content, Marxism, well, it's kind of limiting. But the good thing is that it's nonetheless a structured way of thinking. When it's intelligence, it's a total way of thinking. And here, someone like Hans Hermann Hoppe, who is a libertarian, he was influenced, he admits this, he was influenced by Marxism, and it has enabled him to structure his worldview, although he has renounced, but he has been influenced nonetheless. That's Aufhebung. But he was seduced, like a lot of intelligent young people, by the rigorous aspect of Marxism. And it happened to me as well. More than 10 years ago, I was seduced unconsciously by it was unconscious, but by the rigorous intellectual aspect. Yeah. But then when you grow a little bit, here Peterson said a lot. Sometimes there is really a mystifying aspect in a lot of intellectual doctrines, namely people, they have their own jargon, they develop very complex theories, etc. But sometimes, here that's Occam's razor, sometimes just a little bit of simplification can do a whole lot of good. And here the Anglo-Saxons, they come to the rescue, because philosophically, the wannabe philosophers, they tend to disregard the Anglo-Saxon because philosophically it's not very speculative, it's not very elevated and extremely complex. It's kind of pragmatic, empirical. As Hegel would say, it doesn't contain a lot of thought. It's mostly focused on the realm of phenomena without too much complexification and search for ultimate meanings. It's Anglo-Saxon common sense, and it can be limiting really from a highly speculative point of view, but sometimes when you really have the tendency to wander and to lose yourself, not in a good sense, in pure abstraction, sometimes good old Anglo-Saxon common sense can do a whole lot of good. And there are a lot of mystifying intellectual sects, one might say, a lot of them leftist, which do not survive the test of empiricism, one might say. Namely, sometimes just like Peterson, who is a common sense Anglo-Saxon thinker in a way. There's more to you than that, Mr. Peterson. Of course, he's more subtle because he has great references like Jung, Nietzsche, and etc. But he's nonetheless scientifically, pragmatic, empirically minded, etc. Whereas someone like Zizek, here I'm referring to the debate between Peterson and Zizek, which occurred 4 years ago. Zizek is more a continental thinker with the tendency, even though he claims to be a dialectical materialist, actually he's kind of a speculative, mystical, unconscious Christian thinker. So that's why Zizek might be more appealing, especially to young people, because even though he claims to be a materialist, actually he has a complex way of thinking, but sometimes common sense embodied by Peterson can help bring back simplicity and common sense, there's no other word, to the excesses of really a speculative thinking in the empty way. So yeah, here it's a little bit caricatural, but actually there's an aspect of truth, namely the Anglo-Saxon, they usually come to the rescue of I might say of the Germans. Yes and no, because maybe they have the good aspect. I'm in a good mood here. I'm in a good mood. It's not always the case when I'm dealing in these kind of questions, but the Anglo-Saxons, maybe one of their greatest qualities, they have so many qualities. One of their qualities is that maybe they have the tendency, in a good sense, to save the Germans from their own insanity, maybe. But I remain a German. The Germans, they nonetheless they dominate in the intellectual sphere. They have the tendency to lose themselves, not in a good way, by wandering in too abstract regions of pure intellect. And here the Anglo-Saxons can help a lot, but the structure, the rigor, the depth, the elevation in German philosophy has no equivalent in Anglo-Saxon philosophy. The only way that the Anglo-Saxon can compete in the highest expression of spirit are in poetry and good humor as well, which in a way is a spiritual manifestation. British humor and English poetry, they can compete to a certain extent among the highest expressions of spirituality in a way. And of course the religious inclinations of the Puritans, etc. But why was I saying this? Yeah, because sometimes just common sense is good. And so about Marxism, sometimes just empiricism is enough to refute a lot of dubious aspects. There are intelligent insights in Marxism sometimes. Of course, it has to be acknowledged. It's not meaningless or it's not worthless intellectually, but the excesses, not in a good sense, they have to be balanced and checked by empiricism. I was talking about causal processes. So an intelligent way of thinking is to try to mediate events, phenomena to think intelligently. One way of thinking is to mediate what is precisely immediate. Immediacy means experience through the senses directly, and to think seriously means to mediate that which is given by the senses, by perception, that which is experienced through the senses, to mediate the events, the phenomena, with thought, but with intelligent, consistent, coherent, concrete thoughts. This is, I haven't read Hegel for maybe almost an entire year, and I do not intend to read Hegel. Maybe at some moment, but no. But that's how the phenomenology des Geistes begins, is that sense certainty is knowledge, certainty without thought. And the process of consciousness means to grow by being able to understand, explain, and conceptually grasp the phenomena, and to understand the processes which are being manifested through the phenomena. That which manifests the phenomena, what lies behind, but actually it is made manifest precisely, but to grasp intellectually the sensuous experience of the world is what thinking means. And the Marxists, the intelligent ones, they tend to have the ability to mediate commodities, one might say, through the entire process of production. An intelligent Marxist is able to see, not with his eyes, but with his mind, the entire process of production, which brings about a pair of glasses, or a cap, like this, or fruits like these. They are not local, but I do not buy exotic fruits precisely because I'm ecologically inclined, but they were distributed for free. So instead of being disposed of because they are no longer for sale, I took them for free. That's the only time when I eat exotic fruits, is when they are given for free, because otherwise they have to be disposed of. Yeah, so that's one way of sparing money. Sometimes there are shops which give away foods because they are no longer allowed legally to sell the food, but the food is still edible, so you can make a lot of sparing a lot of money by buying intelligently or getting money for free, getting food for free. Yeah. So an intelligent or a watch, an intelligent Marxist, usually he has the ability, he understands, he sees that behind any commodity, if he is well trained, he sees, not with his eyes but with his mind, the entire process of production to extract the how do you call this, the stuff, the input, the physical stuff. I don't know how you call this in English. Yeah. Then the division of labor, the legislative apparatus, the financial structure which makes capitalistic production available, then the marketing industry, then the shipping industry, the transportation, the advertisement industry, the profits, the management of the worker on the plant or the factory to make as many efficient, etc., etc. Then maybe they can even the Marxists would make a political analysis. Why are the working class? Well, why are they being deceived by a populist like Trump? They should vote for Bernie Sanders, the real Marxist revolutionary. No, actually, no. Yes, that's precisely when Marxism goes goes astray and loses itself not in a good sense. Yeah. So an intelligent Marxist thinker, they are able to mediate commodities, at least, because they tend to think about the economy. They tend to be able to mediate the presence of commodities by the entire process of production, recontextualized within the historical unfolding of dialectical materialism, etc. And precisely this way of thinking formally, not the Marxist content, but formally, in a way, it's a very intelligent way of thinking. That's a Hegelian way. And let us take the example of crime. When there are crimes which are perpetrated in a society, people who think, they seek the cause, the reason, who is to blame, because in a decent, cohesive society, it should not happen, or it should not happen very frequently. And this is empirically what started my own intellectual awakening in 2016. I've already told this story, when there were violent attacks perpetrated in England, Germany, but in my case it was predominantly an attack in France, which really shook me and started my intellectual awakening. I sought to understand why it had happened, because my worldview was shattered, precisely because back then, in 2016, I had a Marxist worldview, and it could not explain reasonably, intelligently, meaningfully why terror attacks had occurred. The software, the Marxist software was no longer applicable. It could no longer explain. That's Occam's razor. It was too complex, although it was much less complex than the kind of thought that I've developed since, but it was too complex, and sometimes more common sense offered by right-wing conservatives in their explanatory proposal was made a lot more sense. Yeah. So, yeah, when there is a crime, people who think about this kind of event, they tend to seek the causes, the reasons, why did it occur, and they want a culprit, someone responsible. Of course, the first way, when I say the simplistic way, but actually it's common sense, is of course the criminal. When a crime occurs, the culprit, the person responsible, in a first moment, of course, it's the person who physically perpetrates the act of violence. Yeah. But when you think, you seek causes. And here that's tied with the conspiracy theory stuff. So who is responsible beyond the agent which physically brings about the crime? And most, if not all, people who think about daily events, of course, when there are acts of violence perpetrated in civil society, most of them, they understand intuitively that actually the criminals, the perpetrators, are not those who are most responsible. Most people who think, they tend to agree, it's not enough behind, precisely, implicitly they all agree, without sometimes being clear about this, without formulating this clearly, but most people who think, well, whether they are on the left or on the right, they tend to attribute the responsibility of crimes. And here I'm talking about criminality, but it can be economic problems, unemployment, loss of shipping away jobs, loss of prosperity, economic crisis, financial bankruptcy, etc. There are many other events, any kind of social event. They tend, those who think, implicitly to agree that the most obvious culprit, here in the case of criminality, is not the perpetrator, because there are factors, causes, reasons, ideas, one might say, which act through the perpetrator. So already they are mediating, they are thinking about the events. And a simplistic way of thinking, usually these are people who, that's why I don't, there are many reasons, but that's one of the reasons why I don't like politics as such, is because people in the political arena, in the mainstream media, or even in the alternative parties, whether on the far left or mostly on the right, the alternative parties or factions on the right, they tend to have a ready-made mental structure, and every time a negative event occurs, they predicate all their ready-made worldview onto this event to try to advance their ideas. That's why it's manipulative, even if it might be partly correct. Even if the content, here let us take an example. Those who blame immigration policies, excessive immigration policies, not the immigrants, but the immigration policies, which are enacted by people who are not immigrants. Precisely, they are enacted mostly by native white people in the case of Western countries. Yes, the right-wing populist thinkers or intellectuals or whatever who tend to blame the excesses of immigration policies onto every negative event tied with immigration. Of course, it's partly true, but it's the content might be partly true, but the form, namely to have a ready-made intellectual package that you repeat every time an event occurs just to legitimize and to gain influence and political power, formally, and the left as well, the leftist, in case of every time there is a crime or there is a economic problem, they come with their ready-made economic analysis. Oh, that's neoliberalism, we need more socialism, we need more regulations, a higher minimum wage. It's because the Thatcher and Reagan, they dismantled the social economic order inherited after the Second World War, which functioned well. The neoliberals are responsible, etc. So the leftists, they are like the right-wingers formally. The content differs, but the formal aspect is the same thing. They have their ideology in the negative sense, and they apply this to every negative event to try to gain influence, and this is intellectually dishonest, but I don't blame them as such, because they are not in a search for understanding or they are not in a philosophical journey in a way. They are just ideologues and politicians, even if they are not empirical politicians, but they are political thinkers, whether they are journalists, intellectuals, scholars, whatever, and their purpose is to gain political influence and power, not to seek the truth or to seek understanding. That's why they want to implement, to force their own ideology onto the phenomena. Sometimes it happens to be correct, at least partly, but a lot of time, even if the content is correct and offers explanatory offers explanations which are consistent and enlightening and valuable in terms of the search for understanding, even if the content is correct, the formal aspect, namely to come with a ready-made intellectual software and to apply in a bureaucratic, formalistic way onto every event, it's anti-philosophical. So, precisely. And the difference between the politicians, here in a sense, not the empirical state elected people, but the people who do politics. Either they want political power or they want political influence. It includes the meta politicians. Depending on the level of intelligence and culture, people tend to mediate the negative events differently. They talk about the same event when they agree that these events are negative, which is not always the case. Some do not even acknowledge that some events are really negative for society, but those who do, they tend to agree on the facts most of the time. Usually the leftists, they disregard the facts, but right-wingers and honest centrist leftists, they tend to agree on the facts, but then the explanation that they provide, precisely they feel the realm of the causal process that they attribute to the event. They fill this with their own views, and because it's not either it's not honest, or it's not sufficient, or it's not complete, or it's not rigorous, or it's not systematic, it tends to leave room for any sort of assertion. So the causal processes are randomly or strategically attributed to the various events depending on who wants to advance what political agenda. But there is a lot of dishonesty or intellectual incompetence, and it's not often mediated. And here I will take an example. Really high quality intellectuals, they tend to blame ideas more than people, because they understand that people are moved, most of them, by ideas. And that's why, let us take the example, the people who blame cultural Marxism. For a lot of people, or the people who blame the EU, in the case of continental Europe, the European Union. I've just been reading a book And Mr. Kaufman explains that in Britain, the distinction between the British National Party and UKIP basically is that the BNP they tended to blame immigration or the immigrants, but immigration, whereas the UKIP blamed the European Union, but basically they agreed implicitly that there was a problem, and there is a problem with modern Britain and the decline and the dramatic changes of population, basically. It has sometimes detrimental effects for the native population, so implicitly they tend to agree, but the UKIP, in a way, they are more politically correct, which has enabled them to gain victories, one might say, because they blame the EU, which is a bureaucratic, faceless institution, but actually the people, the working class and the lower middle class, not because they are less educated or less intelligent, although it partly is the case, but they tend to experience negative events, either in cultural insecurity or criminality or loss of job or loss of purchasing power or the dissolution and degradation of communities, and they want someone to be held accountable to eventually for the problems to be fixed, and the higher status political parties who appeal to a higher social level, like those who appeal to the middle class rather than the working class, they tended, in the case of right-wing British politics, to blame the EU, but here that's UPS, it applies in most formally democratic country. There are political parties which appeal to the middle class, and in modern developed society, although the middle class has been shrinking, it's still the best way to gain political power, because a working class movement in post-industrial society is not very likely to succeed, because there are not many workers like there were in the 19th century and even in the early decades of the 20th century, because the jobs have been replaced by robotization, or they have been sent to China or Asia or wherever. So that's why a populist movement needs the support from the middle class. That's why they have to appeal to more politically correct while remaining politically incorrect slogans and values, etc. That's why they blame the EU. But actually, precisely that's the idea, that those who are responsible for the destruction of communities in Britain and the loss of jobs and cultural insecurity, demographic anxiety, etc., these are the bureaucrats in Brussels. It's easier to blame them because it's far away, removed, we don't know them, and it prevents the politicians from blaming other British politicians, leftist mostly, like Tony Blair. Oh, the British, they tend to have a lot more common sense than the Germans or the French, but sometimes they can go astray as well. Yeah, I just make a remark. The politicians of the 1990s, early 2000s, maybe we hit a low point in Western history. Clinton, Tony Blair, and people like this. Maybe that's the lowest point in. I don't blame them as individuals, but the kind of ideas that they embodied. It was really the end of the boomer ideology, not the end of the boomer ideology, but it was the moment, the end of the 1990s, early 2000s, where the ideology was still at its peak, the multicultural, tolerant, end of history, multiculti, as they call this in Germany, global village, in a sense of let's have a party, let's celebrate, all meaningful struggles are over, let's just drink champagne, everything's gonna be alright. This ideology was still at its peak in the 1990s, early 2000s, but the effects of 30 years implementation of this boomer ideology, here I simplify, boomer ideology was the negative effects were starting to unfold in a significant way. So that was a transition between the end of history ideology and the beginning of symbolically a new era, the early 2000s, where things have become more and more difficult economically, culturally, in terms of tensions and conflicts within Western societies. So yeah, so maybe that's the moment, the Clinton, Tony Blair, in France, it was not much better in a way. The kind of really the politicians who really have had absolutely no idea. They were just bureaucrats. Really, it's probably when the history of Western civilization is written, maybe it will be considered at maybe one of the lowest points in terms of political anthropology, maybe. Yeah. Emptiness, really. Emptiness. Yeah, I have nothing personal against Mr. Blair or Mr. Clinton or the French politician Monsieur Chirac or people like this, but there have been more inspiring Western leaders over the past 25 centuries, one might say. Yeah. Why was I talking about? Yeah. So, depending on the level of intelligence, or culture, or education, or who they want to appeal, the intellectuals here in the broadest sense, it can include the journalists, the politicians, even sometimes the empirical politicians, the intellectuals on the various sense, they tend to predicate a causal agency to more and more abstract entities, and it is very relevant intellectually, but it brings a disconnect, because to blame, here I take example, to blame the Fed, the Federal Reserve, for a lot of problems in America, to blame the EU for a lot of problems in Western Europe, to blame cultural Marxism for a lot of problems in the Western world, or the woke ideology, but actually it's kind of a derivative of cultural Marxism, or the deconstructionist, or the French theory of the 1960s or 70s. From an intellectual standpoint, it's very relevant, it's very intelligent, and it's correct most of the time, but it does not take off with the people because it's too disconnected. But if you think rigorously and seriously, of course, an enormous amount of problems. If I had to name the causal agent without too much complexity, but without too much simplicity, so the most balanced explanatory factor, causal factor, which explain the decline of the West. Let us simplify. Honestly, that's my view. I agree with Ron Paul. That's the Fed, basically, because in a way, the money, those who control the money supply, they have an enormous amount of power over the whole of society, simply because money is a social institution. Money is a social institution. People do not tend to think about this, but it's a commonly accepted. The banknotes and the coins and the banking transactions through credit card, these are exchanges, but they have value. Here the Austrians are clear-minded, the Austrian economists. Money has value only because it is socially accepted. So it's a social institution. That's why those who control the money supply and the legislation surrounding tender, they call it the money which is allowed in exchanges, they have an enormous amount of power because they control a social institution that people use and need daily. And that's why the Fed is the most intelligent in the sense of balanced explanation, because those who control the central banks, they have an enormous amount of power because they can influence politics, academia, they can influence the economy, they can influence big business, journalism, the media, etc., etc. That's why it's not the sole factor, but it's the most balanced, without going too much in conspiracy theory, which can really lead a little bit to insanity, without being too simple-minded, just blaming, oh, let's blame the left, or let's blame this politician, or let's blame this group of people, etc. The Fed, that's why Ron Paul, in a way, is so great. There are many other reasons, but to explain, if an entity has to be blamed while offering a lot of explanation, the central banks, in the case of the European Union, that's the European Central Bank, in the case of America, that's the Fed, but because the banking system is interconnected, the Fed has more power in a way. But to blame the money machine, that's the most intelligent things, because it's in a way it's very balanced. That's my view. But then the problem is that it's not concrete enough either, and to believe that just a tiny group of schemers in the board of the Fed, they have control over America and the whole Western world, or the whole world, it's way too simplistic, precisely because it has to be mediated by other institutions, the economy. But that's what Ron Paul does in his analysis. He does not only denounces the Fed, but the school system, morality, the lack of stability in marriages. Charles Murray talks about this more often, but so education, healthcare, legislation, regulations, academia, politics, Congress, etc. So it's not just the Fed, but that's why Ron Paul is so intelligent, because he talks about a core problem, but while mentioning all the other institutions which mediate the effects that the monetary policies have onto the whole of society. Yeah. Yeah. Because, here, just to take an example, the people who do not necessarily appreciate immigration or the excesses of immigration in Western countries, and the excesses, it can be understood. No people wants to be demographically replaced in a very short amount of time, the way it has been happening. But in a way, even living in a homogeneous society, if an agency like the Fed and the secret services, it is connected, has power over a society to the extent that the Fed and all the institutions which are connected has, the central banking, in a way, the ethnic composition of the population is kind of indifferent, because in the long run, the concentration of power will be sufficient to reshape society completely. Yeah. Yeah. And those who think thoroughly about these topics, precisely, they tend to see the full view of society step by step. They unveil, or they take off layer by layer while understanding the causal relationship, and they tend to see the system, namely what they call the system, but the system is just an abstraction if it is not mediated by the various institutions. And those who see most of the moments of the system, they tend to think systematically, which is a good way of thinking when it's not excessive, and that's really if they dig in their religious roots, they tend to have spiritual experiences. This is what has happened to me and what has been happening to other people, namely those who are able, even if it's unconsciously, but to see the whole, while being religiously inclined, they tend to have spiritual experiences. And yeah. That's why the delirious conspiracy theorists, they might be correct or partly correct sometimes, but if it's just one predicate, they predicate agency to one entity without mediation, without talking about all the aspects, in a way they are delirious, and sometimes they end up becoming a little bit insane, because it's too simplistic while being extremely complex, precisely because among certain thinkers they tend to not to mediate the causal process, namely they predicate all the events to one tiny entity, either the rich, the globalists, etc., etc. But if it's not mediated by how the causal influence proceeds through all the various institutions that I have showed on this document, academia, the school system, the welfare state, politics, family life, the churches or the religious institutions, the media, etc. If it's not the financial system, etc., the secret services, etc., if it's not fully recontextualized, it can lead into insanity, or it doesn't bring a lot of credibility to what they say, precisely because it's too far removed. Yeah. That's I could speak a lot more, but and that I will conclude by saying, to have a philosophical perspective, which can be very exhausting. That's why sometimes it's good to just let go a little bit and ease off, slow down brain activity. To have a philosophical perspective means to be able to give, to see the totality being manifested in each part, and the world, here that's really a philosophical perspective, the whole world is a totality, and the totality is made present in each part. But in order to see this, either there can be really a mystical union with nature, or a communion, a mystical communion with in a religious community, or with the cosmos, etc. It can happen through feelings and spontaneous tendency, but the philosophy of the German idealists, consists in mediating the experience of the world through the conceptual grasping of the totality. It's very demanding. Sometimes it's really exhausting. But to reconstruct the totality through the mind, Das Wahre ist das Ganze, as the German would say. The truth is the whole. And this movement of the totality is the movement of spirit, the all animating, invisible substance which ties together all the parts. Well, that's what I had to say. I could speak much longer about this, but to grasp the unity within the multiplicity, to unite immediacy and mediation, that's a step towards spirituality. That's concrete thinking.